Welcome back, you all, to CHD 100. In this episode, we're going to discuss Chapter 16, Establishing Classroom Limits. Limits are necessary to help children effectively work in groups. They promote safety, respect, responsibility, and self-discipline. Effective limits serve as the goals of a center or classroom. Limits should focus on action and behaviors that reflect those goals. Every area of the classroom will need to have limits, and it will be your responsibility as the teacher to explain and enforce the limits. So join me, Mrs. Murph, as we learn all about establishing classroom limits. So our first objective will be to explain the reasons for having classroom limits. There are three reasons for establishing classroom limits. First, according to the law, children's health and safety must be protected. Limits are boundaries that a teacher established to help the children know appropriate behavior. Second, children feel free to explore when they know their teacher will stop them if they go too far. Thus, they feel protected from making mistakes. And finally, limits help children develop self-control. Our next objective will be listing guidelines for establishing classroom limits. When setting limits for children, make the limits short and positive. Be sure you use the words to describe the exact behavior you desire. Saying return toys to the shelf or take turns with materials, handle books gently instead of be nice, stop it, or behave. For example, for setting classroom limits, be sure to set limits that are reasonable, purposeful, and that the children can actually act out. Post the limits in the classroom. Avoid making too many limits. Define what is acceptable behavior, but also what is unacceptable behavior. And then you should always re-examine your limits on a regular basis and discuss any changes that might occur with your children. Some classroom limits you will see through many early childhood classrooms are listed before you. And I put a little poster on the side. Looking eyes, listening ears, quiet mouth, helping hands, walking feet. So not only are these posted in the classroom, but they also have a visual graphic and kind of a nonverbal gesture to kind of match, okay? So earlier I mentioned that every area of the classroom will need to have limits. So while the classroom limits are overreaching to all aspects of the school day, specific areas and activities need additional limits to help guide the children. So you might have and what that means is you might have some additional limits in your block center. So instead of just the looking eyes, listening mouth, looking eyes, listening ears, quiet mouth, helping hands, walking feet, you may need to have some things that are kind of specific to just that center, okay? Our last objective is describe methods for enforcing limits. I think as a former classroom teacher in an early childhood classroom, this is the biggest key right here. It's very easy to come up with the limits, but enforcing them is kind of where the rubber meets the road. I tell my students all the time, if you can't manage them, you can't teach them. So management of the classroom and enforcing these limits is key to teaching children. Okay, so let's talk about this for a little bit. Children follow limits best when the limits are consistently enforced. And what that means is the consequences of the limit is the same exact thing every time, regardless of who it is, when it is, always the same, okay? Consistency helps children know what is expected of them. However, children will test these as well-established limits, and you should feel comfortable with this testing process at the same time as maintaining your position. Enforcing limits are also required to be flexible at times to adapt to the needs of an individual student. The way you react to children who break limits affects children's feelings of security. What method can you use to clearly communicate limits to young children? As we already discussed, limits need to be short, simple, and reasonable. Some teachers make this easier by dividing their limits into 3 categories: be safe, be kind and respectful, be neat and responsible. And the cool thing about dividing your limits into these 3 areas is under be safe, you can talk about lots of things like walking in the classroom, not running with scissors, all those different types of things that make you safe in the classroom. Also, that is not so limiting be safe that you can't also talk about like outdoor safety. Kind and respectful, be kind to your friends, you know, keep your hands, you know, like have helping hands, be respectful of our classroom, and then being respectful of your classmates and your teacher. Cleaning up after yourself comes into being neat and responsible. Responsible for your own work, responsible for your actions, those kinds of things. When reminding children about certain limits, teachers use one of the categories that we just talked about, and then they follow up with an example. Be neat and responsible by wearing your paint smock when you paint. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. So let's review just a bit. Limits focus on action and behaviors that reflect the goals of the center or classroom. Limits must be made for all classroom areas and for all activities. As the classroom teacher, it is your responsibility to explain and enforce the limits. Limits need to be explained at the children's level of understanding. The staff and children should know the reasons for the limits. Limits that are consistently enforced and fair help create a relaxed atmosphere in the center or classroom. Limits may need to be flexible to adapt to the needs of an individual or to a specific situation. These limits should be reviewed on a regular basis and revised as needed. So that wraps up our information for this episode. You can learn more about this topic by reviewing the resources posted in your course. As always, if you have any questions, please contact me. Thanks again for joining me as we learned all about establishing classroom limits. See you next time.